Do you suffer from anxiety? I do. How about depression? Me too. What if there was another tool you could add to your toolbox for combating the symptoms of anxiety and depression? Today I will speak with Ben Stimpson to discuss Ancestor Veneration, a practice that is ancient and was practiced by the Celts, to see if that might provide some relief to the symptoms of anxiety and depression. Ben is a psychotherapist, a druid, a spiritual practitioner, and an author. My name is Mike, and I'm a recovering accountant on a quest to determine if ancient Celtic practices and traditions can provide some natural relief to the symptoms of anxiety and depression. On this channel, you can join me as I make my way through the worlds of the ancient Celts, Druids, and pagans with a skeptical eye but an open mind. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for inviting me on today.
Thank you for coming on. It's great to talk to you. Maybe we'll start off if you could tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your story.
Absolutely. So it's hours and hours long, that is, to be honest. So I'll cut it short. I am a therapist up in Ontario, but by my accent, you can probably tell that I'm not from Canada. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. So I was born in the UK. I was born in North Wales, which is the topmost part, just kind of adjacent to Liverpool in Wales there. And I moved to Canada when I was 8.5 years old. And over the span of my life, I've been on a bit of a journey to reconnect with that sense of home and really connecting with the UK, because I didn't have a good time when I first came to Canada. And I've always had that sense of wanting to go home. So my spiritual journey has often kind of paralleled my approach to reconnecting. With a sense of identity, with a sense of self, with a sense of home. And so my approach with my spirituality has also really connected in with my wanting to work with people. So my background, on my educational background, is in social work and psychotherapy. And I often then mix the two together. They both have informed my approach in my life to both sides of my work. And so over the past 5 years since I started to practice, I've been really exploring and experimenting. And well, I can't say experimenting, because that sounds like I'm using my clients as experimentation guinea pigs, but I'm not. But my approach to therapy is very much grounded in story and narrative. And part of that exploration for my own self has been mythology and religion and spirituality and narratives around that, which includes things like rituals, which includes things like mythic poetry, mythic experience. So for me, there's no clear boundary between those two. Both inform the other. And I'm also really aligned with, which comes as no surprise, Carl Jung, Jungian psychology, transpersonal psychology, narrative psychology, and kind of the Joseph Campbell approach to mythic like storytelling. That's been part of my professional journey. About 6 years ago now, something like that. The pandemic really threw me out. I don't even know how long it's been, but I stumbled upon OBOD. And up until that point, my spiritual journey had kind of been all over the place. And I was very lucky that I became involved in traditions that would really impact who I am now and my path.
Ben, not to interrupt you, just for the people who don't know, OBOD is the Order of Ovates, Bards, and Druids, and their website is druidry.org. Sorry, Ben, I just wanted to put it in there in case anyone doesn't know what OBOD is.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. So the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, I had originally stumbled upon them because I was wanting to connect in a spiritual way with my background. Being in Canada, we have such a mix, being in North America, we have such a mix of different traditions. And so I really wanted to connect with my personal background. And so somebody suggested Druidry. I started looking into it, started listening to the podcast, the main official podcast of the order. And at that time, I was commuting back and forth. So I had a lot of time to listen. And I fell in love with the order, and then I decided to join. So Druidry has really been a part of my spiritual practice for the past 6 years. And the more I get into it, the more deeper it connects with my spirituality and also my professional therapy side. So that's a little bit about who I am.
What aspects of the OBOD Druidry course or materials do you find the most helpful and useful to you, or that most resonates with you?
Absolutely. So I can't speak specifically to some of the specifics because they do prefer that people find that out for themselves. I will say that one of the draws originally was I was in a kind of a weird place in my life. I was still studying psychotherapy at the time. I was commuting back and forth from my parents' house after a big upset in my life. I was living with them for a while, and so listening to the Druidcast, I heard people who were not only interested in the things I was, but people who sounded like me. A lot of the people who were being interviewed in the earlier sessions were all people from the UK, and they were also grounded in their lives, who were also, I'd say, confident in their lives. And at that point in my life, I was in a depressive state. I was in a slump in my life. I had a big upset a few years before, which put my education on hold. And so I was really needing a sense of community. But of course, I was saying to Mike before, I just relocated to where my parents are living now, just to save money for right now. And we're in the middle of the boonies. It's like an hour till, the major places. It's similar to where I was living back then. I needed a sense of community. And so listening to the interviews by David Bard, who's the host of the podcast, listening to people talk about their paths and their spiritual sides and their lives, and then gatherings that were happening over there, it made me really connect in with something called a paracosm. Paracosm is like an imaginary world that we construct for ourselves. And in that paracosm was my homeland, me being happy and me having a wonderful time with all these wonderful people and this and that, all the other. So in a way, that process was actually very similar to what the course material works with. So the course material works a great deal with story and connecting with self through mythical figures. A lot of the Obod course material is based on Welsh and Irish, and being from Wales myself was very familiar. So it's that connecting in with deities and saints and all of these interesting, huge mythical figures from this land. I really connected with it. So I enjoyed that to begin with. The more I get into the material, the more I can see that it is a transformational, parts of it is a transformational process. That's the parts that I really connect with. The OBOB material is written in such a way that people can find themselves in any area of their life and find something that resonates with the material. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the early stages, so the material hasn't started to come together yet for me. And I know it will. But the thing, this might sound funny, that I enjoy about it the most is the triads.
Yes.
I love the triads.
Yes.
If you just really put some deep thought into it, you can learn so much about yourself.
Totally. Yeah.
I actually went and looked up other triads online because I couldn't wait for the next lesson to see what the next triad is.
Yeah. Very beautiful part of the cultures over there, and they speak to. I think they speak to, again, that mythical place. It's not pegged down to any particular time frame. Anybody of any cultural background, anybody of any time period can connect in with those triads because they speak to humanness as opposed to a particular cultural, part, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And that's Obod's form of Druidry. There are other Druidries that are more prescriptive. It's, I guess more of the Reconstructionalists who it's our way or the highway, but they don't really. It's kind of hard to say what it was, what they're reconstructing, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, that is one thing. So those who are listening, one of the major criticisms and also one of the major kind of fascinating aspects of Obot is that it is not trying to present itself as a reconstruction of ancient Celtic tradition. It has always stated, at least the leaders who I know have always stated, that it is trying to build a living, grounded tradition of the 21st century, 20th century too, using material looking back to 1,000-2,000 years ago. They're not a reconstructionist tradition. They're not trying to be. And there are traditions out there that are trying to build or reconstruct or to develop a living system now based on a reconstruction of what they believe, which is perfectly fine. But I think people can sometimes approach Obod thinking that it's trying to be ancient Druidry, and it isn't. Its own different narrative course. It has its own different evolution. And so I think some people can sometimes be disappointed with it. But for those who aren't interested in coming from a Reconstructionist bent, I think that they will find a lot within Obod.
Yeah, the way I usually explain it to people is it's in the spirit of Druidry. It's not actual Druidry, but it's in the spirit.
Well, and this is the thing too. What is actual Druidry? This is a big question that you see online and in various forums all the time. Druidry means different things to different people and different cultures. So, like being from Wales, if you speak to the average Welsh person, they're not interested in, or they're not even aware that there is a spiritual form of Druidry in the form of Obod or ADF or whatnot. For them, Druidry is a cultural manifestation of Welsh culture, and a container for Welsh, predominantly Welsh language and Welsh medium arts and culture. And so the Gorsedd of Cymru is the major arts tradition. And so when you see, the gathering of the Druids in white, green, and I think brown in Wales, that's a cultural tradition that started about 200 years ago. Has nothing to do with ancient Druidry, but it is in spirit. It's connected to ancient Druidry because a lot of the stories from Wales are, the Taliesin stories and the Mabinogi and so forth, right? So similar material, but just brought differently, right?
Yep. So I wanted to bring up something that now I'm starting to believe in, which I apply it to Obod, and yes, everything's in this, I think is in this, they do things in the spirit of Druidry, but I'm also really starting to believe in kind of as the best way to put it, a spiritual DNA. Basically, I feel like the spirituality of our ancestors are somehow coming through to us, are a part of us. So, if way back when, your ancestors were Druids or Celts or whatever the case may be, I feel like some part of that is in us now as descendants. So, doing things in the spirit of Druidry, even though it's not exactly what they did, in my mind, it kind of is in a way because that inner Druid is in you and you're doing it. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well. And, I know your specialty is with ancestors, and it might be a good time also to discuss your book a little bit. But what are your thoughts on like kind of like a spiritual DNA or something to that effect?
I'll be honest with you. I see it from a very different point of view. I guess being from the UK, but having spent most of my life in North America, my relationship to kind of that material and my relationship to that land is as somebody who was born there. And so for me, I tend to see it from a very grounded in the land approach, right? I see it through a sense of relationship. So I feel like individuals who live in a space and experience that space on a regular basis, have a certain relationship with that landscape. And I do believe that the landscape tends to soak up all of the different relationships that has been part of that with all sorts of different peoples over a span of however many years. And so I do believe that when people in the diaspora talk about that sense of home and belonging to home, I feel like it's a cultural resonance to relationships that exist within their family. Because, for example, like your background is Italian, right? Or part of your background.
Part of it, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So what part of Italy is your family descended from?
Southern Italy, Calabria.
Southern Italy. Yeah, Calabria. Do you have a same feeling for Calabria and Calabrese culture as you do for, say, the Irish?
No, and part of it is because I've never been there.
Right.
And that was the big thing with Ireland. I just felt the connection. I've been to Italy, but at that point in time, I didn't know where my family was exactly from. It was pre-ancestry.com days.
Oh, yes.
So I hadn't had the genealogical research to know exactly where. All I knew was Calabria. I didn't know like exactly where then. We were going to go actually to the exact place my family's from, but then the pandemic came.
Yes. I know so many people who were planning trips back home, and then the pandemic hit, and it's like they're only just getting back to it now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So then with that, I would say my personal belief, anyways, not to disagree with you, but my personal belief is that there's something about Ireland then that has resonated within your family, this cultural memory that's kind of still within that system for you, that social system for you. And so that becomes reinforced when you go to a place. And this is very common. A lot of people in that diaspora who end up going back to Europe and seeing these ancient homelands that are divorced from them for like maybe sometimes 150, 200 years. But there's something still about that sense within the family of the homeland, right? And
sense
so
that you belong there.
It's like that's often what people say, that sense of belonging there, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it's that spiritual relationship. When you become grounded in that landscape, when you start to relate to that landscape, you're developing a relationship. And what it can often feel like then is that, oh, well, I'm relating through my ancestors. I think that that idea just reinforces, almost gives you permission to have that relationship, right? So for me, like within my ancestry, I have Cornish, Irish, Scottish, English, and Welsh, all within the past 4 generations, right? I don't have a strong sense for Ireland, even though I know the name of the ancestor who came over to England 170 years ago, 160 years ago. But I don't have any sense of feeling towards Ireland, right? Because I don't have that relationship. So in that way, for me, it hasn't been my lived experience that people have, or that I have an ancestral spiritual connection to a place. But I do think that there's a certain relationship that can be built when we know that our ancestors had a connection to a place. I think that that resonates, and I think that we connect through that ancestor to that landscape in a different way. But I think we're also connecting to it in a different way for ourselves too.
Yeah,
I hope
definitely
that
makes
answers your
sense.
question.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, there's different ways to approach it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what determines exactly where you resonate with and where you don't, but you know when it does. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Absolutely. And it's that feeling. In Welsh, we have a word called hiraeth, which is, it doesn't translate directly to English, but it's this deep nostalgic longing for a place that may have never actually existed. But it's that deep longing for old, that return to a golden age. And so like a lot of my experience with the UK and Wales particularly is hiraeth. Like the UK of my memory when I was a kid, it does not translate directly to what it is now, right? And I've talked to a lot of friends over there and people I've been connecting with over there about that idea of culture shock and the idea that, you know, when I go over there, I'm moving over there next year actually, so I
Right.
am in the active process of relocating, that it will be different. And I lived over there for about 6 months in about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, like a summer working visa. Well, not visa, I was working over there for a summer, and it was different. It felt different from when I was 8.5 years old, 15 years before that. I think that both forms are still important. I connect to the place through that memory, and then the onus is on me to explore that place, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting. If you're enjoying this video, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon next to it. Also, please click on the thumbs up button to show me that you like this video. I think that's a good segue. You want to tell us a little about your upcoming book about
Absolutely, yes.
ancestry or
Absolutely.
ancestor,
Ancestor
as I should
Veneration,
position.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my book is coming out through Llewellyn worldwide in September. September for North America, and I think probably December for UK and Europe. It's called Ancestral Whispers, and it's a guide to building a relationship with your ancestors through a living veneration practice. So for a lot of people who are of Western background, ancestral veneration is quite an alien and foreign topic, right? But in recent years, and especially with the pandemic, where death was such a big part of the culture for such a long time, there is this sense, I think, a real interest in connecting in with ancestry. And there's multiple reasons for that. I think you're one of those examples, right? You have this connection with this homeland of Ireland. You were telling me a little bit about that journey before, and I know you've spoken about it in your podcast before. You went to that place and you had that experience of feeling like you were at home, that sense of belonging. And I think a lot of people in diasporic communities, regardless of what diaspora you were talking about, has that sense of a connection to a home, right?
Right.
Partly, I think, because of that cultural memory, but also I think there's something about connecting with ancestors and their relationship to that landscape, right? So the book is around how to develop a living veneration practice for people who don't come from or don't have the benefit of coming from a family tradition or a culture that has ancestor worship and veneration as a core component. I think a lot of people in the West have become interested in it recently because of death, but also because we're seeing a lot more in media. The movie Coco, for example, the whole adventure is based around the Day of the Dead, Mexican Day of the Dead, and the rituals connected to working
Right.
with one's ancestor and engaging with one's ancestors. And I think the West used to have that. We used to have very strong traditions of working with the dead and engaging with the dead in a different way within a Jewish-Christian context. But I think we've lost that, especially in kind of the target audience, which is the pagan community, the metaphysical community, the New Age community, spiritual communities. People are divorced mostly from their traditions of birth, Christianity, Judaism, or from secular backgrounds, right? And so this book is a guide not to tell people how to practice, but for them to relate to and engage and build a practice that is unique, that is intimate, and that is relating to their ancestors. So the book is split into two parts. The first is to lay out all the different ways that we can conceptualize ancestors, the dead, persons, right? I'm pretty proud of how I wrote it. I don't tell people what to believe. I lay out all sorts of different beliefs from around the world with examples, with concrete examples, and how people around the world are relating to their ancestors through these traditions. And then I ask the question, what do you believe? What makes sense to you? And so really it's more of an intermediate type book, and it's begging the questions. It's a coaching book, really.
Okay.
So the first part is that the thinky bit, kind of how do you conceptualize, what do you believe about the world? How do you believe about the ancestors? Who are the ancestors? I also talk a great deal about different types of ancestors too. So we often think about ancestors as blood relatives. And when you actually really deconstruct ancestor, there's a lot of different ways that term can be applied. And this is where the Druidry piece comes in. What would it be like to see the sky as an ancestor? Because in many ways, the sky, space, is our ancestor. All the molecules in our body come from outer space, right? What would it be like to see the sea as an ancestor? Because our ancient ancestors emerged out of the sea and they evolved in the sea, right? All of those fake pieces, right? What would it be like to see mythical characters as ancestors? So if you look at a lot of most cultures around the world, actually, they have groups of people and families where there is some sort of a mythical ancestor, whether that be a deity, whether that be a creature. In certain parts of Ireland and North Sea, you have families that say that they descend from Selkies, the seal people. Same with fairies down in England and other parts of Europe, right? So what is it like to engage with the stories of these types of ancestors, right? And then what do you believe constitutes an ancestor? How do you relate to the stories of those ancestors then, right? So then the second part of the book is around actual practice. So I deconstruct and I talk about all of the different elements of what a living practice can look like, from prayers to how are you using sacred space? Are you building an altar? Are you building a shrine? What do you do with that shrine? How do you engage with your ancestors through that shrine? The major point I make around spiritual practice is that everything is a form of communication. So everything that you do in a spiritual context communicates something to the other world, right? The world of supernatural. Also, what you're relating to yourself. What are you communicating to your family? What are you communicating to yourself through this? So a lot of the pieces in that are deconstructing bit by bit. What is the actual, like offerings, for example? What do you offer? What is the purpose of an offering? All of those. So that's the second part, is really the nitty gritty. And a lot of that stuff can actually be applied to spiritual practice in general. So I'm quite pleased with how that went. And again, it always comes back for me to relationship. What is your relationship to yourself? What is your relationship to your ancestors? And how are they relating to you? Right?
Yeah.
So.
That's fascinating. I can't wait to read it. It's definitely a topic that I feel doesn't get enough coverage. And a few specific questions about what you just said. So what do you think of like the concept of having some sort of draw or bond or relationship to a specific ancestor? Like in my case, it's a blood relative going back, many generations, but I just feel its connection to them and their life.
Absolutely. There's many ways I could take that question. Do you want to explain that a little bit more and I can give my thoughts on it? Or
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is my great great grandfather on my father's side of the family, on his maternal side of the family. The ancestor's name is Michael Fox. He came from County Longford in Ireland. And he immigrated over here to New York in the 1850s. And I don't know if this is why, but I happen to know a lot about his life because he was always involved in stuff. But I just feel it's like strong connection to him. Like I can almost put myself in his shoes or look through his eyes in a way when he got on one of those coffin type boats from Ireland and came over here. You know what? And he's surviving the famine. Obviously, I'd never experienced any of those things, but I feel like I have a better idea of like what he went through,
Right.
even though I have no idea if that makes
Right.
any sense.
Right. That does no, that makes a lot of sense to me. That makes a lot of
I
sense
mean,
to me.
he fought in the Civil War. He was on the battlefield on the bloodiest day in American history. I
Wow.
mean, he did a lot of like crazy things. There was more stuff compressed into his I wouldn't say short, but his life that
Mm-hmm.
than I could ever dream of. But I almost feel like in a way I could vicariously live it through him.
Okay, that piece around you're living vicariously through him. What is it that, because it sounds like you have a strong feeling towards him, and it sounds almost like you're inspired by him. Is that true?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say so.
Yeah.
I guess
What?
like the things that he did of sacrifice, of taking care of his family,
Mm,
doing what needed to be done, and also being very flawed in the process.
mhm. Do you see yourself as flawed?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I suspected that as a leading
Yeah.
question, but so well, you answer your own question then. What do you think then? What's your relationship to your ancestors, and why do you relate?
I guess I appreciate and almost look up to the way he lived his life. And, and there's certain aspects that, I would want to emulate,
That's
almost kind of like a role model. Some
absolutely,
of his flaws, not so
yeah.
much, but
Well, his flaws make him human, right? That's the
right.
beautiful thing,
But the
right?
thing is, like, I can't figure out, am I romanticizing him, or is there actually some sort of connection
That's a good
that,
question.
yeah,
That's a really good question. It strikes me that it's probably both. It could be a little bit column A, a little bit of column B.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Which is okay. What I love about what you just explained there, and I appreciate you allowing me to kind of turn that question onto you, is that you connected with his story and you connected on an intimate way with his story. And I think that that is what I would say when we are connecting with ancestors. We're connecting to their story.
Oh,
There's some kind of a resemblance that we're seeing in an ancestor's story that we see in our own life. And it makes it even more vivid when we know that we came from. Right? That's a beautiful thing with ancestors that I don't think we necessarily get from other forms of spirits or other forms of figures in our spiritualities, is that we have that direct, intimate connection, right? And so do all of the ancestors
right.
in between us and them, right? So there's a continuation there. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
I think it's what makes family history, even outside of an ancestral veneration practice, just family history. I think that's what makes it so compelling for so many of us. It's why so many people look into their family history. I mean, you look at ancestry.ca or ancestry.com, all of their adverts. It's like, find out who you are. And it is kind of tying it to psychotherapy here. When I was training, so I started training in about 2017. And at that point in my life, I was living in a city close to Toronto with a godfather of mine in a spiritual tradition called Santeria Lukumi. And it's an Afro-Cuban tradition. It
Hmm.
works with nature spirits and similar to voodoo, but not the same. But a large part of their work is through ancestral work. And so I was really engaging with my ancestors through a ritual context. And at the same time, miraculously, one of the big projects in my psychotherapy program in the first year was something called a genogram, which is a very specialized approach to looking at family history, which tracks information down generational lines. So you create a family tree, and then
Right.
you're tracking where does specific information like addictions, mental health concerns, issues, subpersonalities, all of this information you can track to show where else it appears in the family,
Hmm.
and particularly narrative, so family cultures and family narrative. And so I was engaged really with my family story and also in this kind of ritual process and learning about the stories from my parents of ancestors from 4 generations back, and then looking at the records online, also while engaged with a spiritual connection with them, made them very, very real to me. And so I developed relationships with certain ancestors, and I talk about that in the book. The book I wrote, it's a very personal work because I feel like this is, again, family work is very personal work, right?
Yep.
So I found there were ancestors that I suddenly understood and had a lot more compassion for, because I understood a little bit more about their context, their story, and also I could see their hands in my life now. I'll give you a very good example. So both my parents are entrepreneurs. They came over from the UK and went straight into business. They founded a quite profitable business over the span of 25 years. They just retired recently, which is good. But like being their own bosses was really important for them. So when I started delving into my family story, I could see that same narrative was again and again and again throughout the generations. And I figured out there was some interesting connections between both sides of the family. Both my maternal and paternal great grandfathers were connected with the black market trade during World War One. So they would go down to the ships in Liverpool Harbor, and they would trade with American ships there for luxury goods that you wouldn't be able to get in the UK at that time. And they would take them back to their shops, and they ran black marketing. They were black marketeers. A lot of people were connected with that back then, just to get things like pantyhose and like sugar and all sorts of stuff like that, right? So when I looked at those figures, I was like, okay, this is interesting, because 2 generations before them were people who were involved in and were destitute in the workhouse. The workhouse was the England's and the UK's only way of social safety net, and it was literally, if you were penniless and you had nothing, you would go to the workhouse, and you were basically, it was a debtor's prison, basically, right?
Right.
So both of those ancestors, 2 generations before these great grandfathers, were in the workhouse. They were at their lowest of the low, because society was not kind back then. They built themselves up, and they, through entrepreneurship, through finding ways of surviving, and that then carried down through the generations. And then no kidding, my mom and dad met each other, recognized that inside themselves, and then had us, right? So I see a lot of those ancestors and the struggles that they went through in my own life, because I'm building my own practice, and I'm becoming an entrepreneur myself, and I know how hard it is and how difficult it is. But I'm inspired by them. Working with both the story and also then the spiritual practices around it, suddenly that story made it very real for me. And I saw myself as a part of that story. And I think that's, by the sounds of it, that's your experience too. You see yourself as part of his story. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. A point that I think is very important too is when you're looking at your ancestors, you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes and look at their lives through their lens and not yours.
Absolutely.
Like for example, my ancestor I was talking about before, Michael Fox, he fought in the Irish Brigade in the American Civil War. And a lot of Irish, enough that they had a whole brigade just out of, mostly New York, joined up because they wanted to prove their loyalty to the new country and perhaps get training in the military way to go back and fight England to get them out of Ireland. But when Lincoln came out with the Emancipation Proclamation, the Irish were not too happy. They didn't want to free the slaves, and they would stop enlisting. And then when they instituted a draft, they had a big draft riot in New York City. But the thing is, if you look at it through their lens, were they really racist, or was it self-survival? You have people who just survived the famine, are unskilled, illiterate. They came to a new country, and the only thing they could do is, menial labor, digging ditches or whatever. And if these slaves are freed, they're going to all go flowing into the North and compete with them for those low-wage jobs. It's more a matter of survival to them, not about racism, but survival. I find it problematic when people apply the lens of the current world to different time periods, not thinking about what they went through.
Absolutely. There can be a certain romanticism around the past, or problematizing the past. And I talk about that in the book as well. I talk about how, when people are connecting with their ancestral story and connecting with their past, what they're actually doing a lot of the time is they're teasing out their own story. So this is a very common thing in paganism, where people who are coming from birth traditions like Christianity, with a lot of religious trauma baggage, or coming from a place of insecurity, a place of a really insecure place. They're on a journey. They're on a seeking themselves out, right? Oftentimes, you will see people who they will connect very strongly with their ancient pagan ancestors because, fuck those Christians. Sorry, I hope that's okay to say. Like all of those Christians in between, those pagan ancestors 2,000 years ago and now, they mean nothing. They're all traitors. They're all this. I'm really connected with my heathen ancestors, right? And what that is actually doing is reinforcing where the individuals are in their own lives now. If you look at it from a genealogical sense, it doesn't make any sense to connect with a small group of pagan ancestors from 2,000 years ago, because by then, majority of the world is connected to you, right?
Right.
If you think two parents, four great grandparents, 8 great grandparents, by the time you get 2,000 years ago, which is, I think that's something like 40 generations back. I think I did research into that once, but there are millions of ancestors.
Right.
There are millions all over the world, everywhere, right? So why are you connecting only particularly with that one little group on a tiny little archipelago in the middle of the Atlantic when you have ancestors all over the place? And it's because of your own story. And I think that's a key understanding piece when people are starting to work with ancestors is, okay, how are you actually showing up to this work? And how are you showing up to this family story? And what biases are you going to then project back onto your ancestors? It's a co-creative process. And I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing, because that can also, as unhealthy as that aspect might be, there's also very, very healthy ways that feed healthy aspects of our personalities, right? So I think the ancestors then become, what's the word? We project onto those ancestors. I think it's a very human thing. But I think it becomes a problem when we insist that your version or the version that you're working with of that past is the past, has to be the past. Because if it isn't the past, then who am I suddenly? At that point, then you've entangled your self-esteem and your sense of self in with these ancestors who are off enjoying their afterlife, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, hopefully, right?
I don't remember where I read this, so unfortunately I can't give proper attribution to whoever said it. But I read something where the author made the point that when you're doing ancestor veneration, yes, you can venerate your actual bloodline ancestors. Yes, you can venerate, like you were saying, your specific tribe, if you know it, or a specific group of people in a certain area. But it's also important part of ancestor veneration was just venerating all the people who came before you, whether you had a direct connection or not. How does that sit with you? What do you think of that?
Oh, I totally agree. I think when we look at how ancestor veneration practices around the world are usually kind of constructed, and part of my process of writing this book was I wanted to try and give a good sampling of the ways that ancestor traditions and spiritual traditions in general kind of manifest around the world, so people can find themselves. When you look at how many traditions evolve around the planet, a lot of the times you have this idea of the collective. And this can manifest, for example, in the idea of individuality being subsumed into a collective through things like the bones of the ancestors being mixed in with a mass collective, so that it's impossible to then identify individuals, right? Oftentimes this is a very natural process, because the reality is, after 100 or 150 years, the vast majority of people are going to be forgotten. When they move out of living memory, there's no one left who will remember them specifically.
Right.
Then you're individually gone, but you're still part of the collective. You're still part of the ancestors. So when I work with ancestor work, I don't just work with individuals. I work with all of them, because they are all my ancestors, right? And the other thing too is that when you look at ancestor work and ancestors, there's very, very, very few people. If you have siblings, your siblings and you are the only people who have the same set of ancestors. When you really think about it, your parents, your parents have half each of your ancestor set, but they don't share them all. So ancestors are both entirely unique, but they're also entirely connected to everybody else. Because while every single one of your ancestors is unique to you, every single one of those ancestors also have multitudes of descendants the further back you go.
Right.
So, to the extent that it's not a family tree, it's a family web. right? And it's fascinating when you go on to any of the like ancestry.com or my family search, right? And connect in with, you know, distant cousins who are connected to you through an ancestor from like 4 generations back.
Right. Yeah.
And you it's amazing the connections, right? And you're like, okay, this is cool. We have this connection because we're connected to this one individual, and then all of his ancestors or her ancestors, but we don't know each other and we don't have any relationship, right? It's incredible. So I do believe that it's very strongly important to think of your ancestors as a collective. But what does that necessarily mean? It's up to you to decide. Does that mean that your practice is going to be, you know, putting food down generally, like, you know, creating offerings that are generalized to all of the ancestors? Does that mean necessarily that you see yourself more as part of the human race as opposed to, you know, tribal lines, right? And I think it really depends on how you approach it. This is the thing; it's choose your own adventure.
Yeah, I agree with you. What you said in the beginning, how the Western world is kind of lost touch with ancestor veneration, and I'm guilty of many years ago even mocking it. My wife's from Taiwan, and her family's Buddhist,
Right.
and you know she has a little shrine in our living room with pictures and a candle and whatever else, incense, I should say, and whatever else. And I thought it was kind of ridiculous back years and years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I never understood it. And now I'm starting to get it. When I built my first altar,
Mm-hmm.
um, to kind of test it out. Similarly, in Taiwan, they have a system, I guess, where after you die, you're buried, but once every X many years, I forget if it was 10 or 20, they open up the family tomb,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody who's died since the last time it was open, the bones get put in there and closed up. And I never really understood that either. And I didn't mock that one, but I just didn't understand it. But I guess it's all about, you know, learning and education and looking at it through their eyes, what they're
That's
doing.
exactly it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think in truth, that really is the core of just living in a human community, right?
Yeah.
Every spiritual tradition has its own logic. And if you're looking from it from the outside, it doesn't make sense to you. But that doesn't mean that it's primitive or that it's illogical, right? And in truth, I have to be honest, this is one of my issues with the whole skeptics community. You see a lot of people who are skeptical of spiritual traditions and spirituality in general and religion in general. And what you're essentially doing, not you particularly, but
Yeah.
in general,
Yeah.
is that they're they're privileging one set of logic over another. So in Thai culture, you said Taiwan, sorry, in Chinese culture, cultures, I should say, there is a very specific logic around
Yeah.
ancestor veneration, right? It is the fact that if you don't take care of your ancestors when they're dead, they're going to fuck you up. They're going to come and they're going to mess things up until they get what they want because you have a direct allegiance to them. They gave you life, and so you owe them veneration in the past. You owe them respect because they are your elders, right? In the same way that people who are in those cultures, people who are younger than you owe you respect because you are their elder, and so on and so on. And I actually talk about that. What Confucius says. Confucius, in Chinese culture, he departed from kind of the mystical elements of Taoism, and he looked at it from a social concept, right? The benefit of ancestor veneration in Chinese culture, according to Confucius, was if you can learn to cater to the needs and respect people you don't see who aren't visible in the world, then you can learn to do that with people who are. And so it binds all of society together, right? And it also makes you a better prepared as an ancestor in waiting. And that's the other thing I talk about in the book too, is that, you know, oftentimes we think about ancestor veneration and spiritual traditions as a personal process. And that's a very Western thing. We talk about, you know, our journey, us as seekers, and so on and so on. When spirituality around the world is mostly about community. It's about fitting into community and creating bonds in community and strengthening community, because that's our ancestral journey as a human species. As a group, we have survived. You know, individualism is really a very modern concept, right? So this idea that we're ancestors in waiting, that we will have responsibilities to the dead in the same way that the living, when we're dead, have responsibilities to us, And we also have responsibility to the living when we're dead, right? If that makes sense.
No, no, it definitely does. Topic we could probably discuss for hours, but
Yeah.
uh, in the interest of time, I'll kind of switch gears a little bit. A little bit. What are your thoughts about ancestor veneration and the effects it might have on mental health?
Absolutely. So I was thinking about this when looking at your other podcast interviews around Druidry. And in the same way, I would say that Druidry in many spiritual traditions, well, most spiritual traditions, can have an impact on mental health. Ancestor veneration can as well. And I talk about that a lot in the book too. It's knowing yourself. So ancestor veneration, ancestral work, spiritual work is about knowing yourself so that you become the best version of yourself. And that's co-creative with all of the stories of these individuals. So like we were saying before, your ancestor Michael, you are inspired by his story about the things that he went through, or what you know of what he went
Right.
through. And so in that process, you then will be reevaluating your own life in the same way that I evaluate my own life in thinking about the stories of my ancestors, right? So they become springboards for us to become the best versions of ourselves. And I think in that process, that's about not only taking accountability and taking responsibility for our lives, but also empowering ourselves. So when we connect in with our true essential self, our best selves, when we are able to empower ourselves through these stories and through these spiritual relationships, we then become, in a kind of a grander scheme, more in line with our own sense of self and purpose. And that, I think, is an aspect of personal work that will always move us into the best places in our lives, or can help contribute to that. A lot of things like depression, situational depression, not clinical depression, situational depression, situational anxiety, a lot of mental health issues that are connected to situations as opposed to kind of chemical
Right. Right.
biochemical
Yeah. Right.
imbalances. They're very much bound up with our self-esteem and where we're at in our life. Physical health problems, for example, people who have lower back issue because
Yeah,
there's
it's
so
me.
much in their shoulder. There you go.
Yeah, I have my
you
cane
know,
right here. Spinal
there we go.
stenosis.
So a lot of people who have lower back issues like that, right? A good part of that is also posture, right? There's other issues, of course,
Right.
right?
Of course. Yes.
But you can tell when somebody is so down on themselves because they're not in a good, healthy place in their life. Something in their shoulders, they're like this. They may put on weight because they're not taking care of themselves. And I'm not saying putting on weight is only because of not taking care of yourselves. Obviously, there's other reasons for
Right.
weight. But when somebody's not in that right place in their life, they can be very hard on themselves because they're going into cocoon mode, they're going into protective mode, however way that is. So when somebody starts to work on their empowerment and has control in their life of the things that they're able to control, then that's a springboard for them to move into working on themselves, taking care of themselves, finding the healthy things in their life, and living a healthier life, right? So I think that connection there is key, and I think additionally, I think also, figuring out what is environmental and what is inherent, right?
Right.
So a lot of mental health issues they're both, right? They're both biochemical, but they're also situational too. And
Oh
so
yeah.
figuring out the situational pieces and all of that piece can then help the mitigate the biochemical stuff.
Absolutely. Now,
Mm.
I'm hopefully within by the end of the month going to put out like a mini ebook guide about using some Celtic practices
Mm.
to hopefully relieve anxiety and depression.
Mm.
And there's about I don't know 7 or 8 specific practices
Mhm.
that I've tried. There were practices that were brought forward. We know they're Celtic because they were brought forward by the Christians who came to Ireland and said that's where we got it from.
Mhm.
But my main thrust in the beginning is that all these practices are well and great, and I invite you to try them with me to see if they
Mhm.
work for you. But none of them matter if you're not building on a solid foundation.
Mhm.
Just like anything else, if you keep piling stuff on and that's foundation isn't strong, it's going to topple over. So my first piece of advice to people is you need to build that strong foundation. And a lot of that is getting to know yourself, who you are,
Mhm.
kind of build up your confidence and your
Absolutely.
understanding of yourself. Like one of my
Absolutely.
recommendations, other than going like to Ancestry to learn what you don't know, but also is building an altar,
Hmm.
because that gives you a base, you know. And even if you take it down, if you have it up and for so long, like I did, I have to keep taking mine down for various reasons to
Hmm.
move things around. But if you know it intricately enough, it's always in your memory, it's always in your head.
Hmm.
And if you
Hmm.
make that altar remind you of who you are. On my
Yeah.
altar, I had pictures of ancestors. I had some mementos and things related to them that were important. I had some things that were important to me. I didn't go so far as putting anything to represent gods on there, because I wasn't at that point, and I don't know if I will be. But my biggest advice to people was, before you do anything, you got to know who you are. You have to have a solid foundation.
Absolutely. And it sounds for you then that the creating of the altar space and that space for you to work is that exploration of self using these spiritual guides like the ancestors, and it becomes a co-creative relationship by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I mean, even
Yeah.
just the process of thinking, what do I want to put on my altar?
Mhm.
That's just, you just reaching deep into your into your soul, or whatever you want to call
Mhm.
it, to force yourself to figure out who you are,
Yes.
or at least some part of who you are. And then I guess it can confirm too if you're on the right track. You know, when I had my altar set up, and I had I don't have a picture of that great great grandfather or anything, but I had a little Irish Brigade flag, and
Mhm.
you know, instead of burning just candles, I was burning turf incense, and
Mm,
getting
mhm,
that smell. It
mhm,
was like a multi-sensory experience. It was visual, smell, just trying to encompass everything, that whole feeling in there.
mhm. Engage
Yeah,
with the
exactly. That's a good way
story.
of putting
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't necessarily matter what the spiritual practice is. There are so many versions and ways of doing it all around the world, but it comes back again to that relationship, and that's why, for me, my entire spirituality is based on relationship, and I really push that in my therapy work too. Relationship really is everything to me, and so when you're engaging with practices, whatever they are, be very mindful of kind of what are you relating to in that practice.
Right.
What is the connection there, and what are you connecting to? Yeah.
Yeah. What's drawing you in?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think too, an important point is that it doesn't have to be a physical thing,
Hmm.
as like an actual altar in place. I
Hmm.
used to think it had to be, and like for Druidry, I'm like, how am I going to get into Druidry when, you know, I used to love being outside in the nature, but maybe that caused my allergies. But I'm allergic to everything environmental except for mold,
Mm, right.
and I haven't met a bug yet who didn't think biting me was a good idea.
Right.
So like, how am I going to go out into nature to kind of achieve that balance?
Mm,
And when I was talking to Philip Cargam, he said it doesn't matter. That nature could be in your head. We build a
absolutely.
sacred space in there, and that's kind of what I do with my altar.
Yeah.
You know, because I built it and I put thought into what I was setting up, and I used it however many times. You
Hmm.
know, I can go. You know, I don't want to say pray, but I can go sit at my altar and do spiritual work, even when it's not there.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Yeah, because you're still connecting in with
Right.
that story, that sense, that I used the word paracosm before, that kind of mini universe inside our heads, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, this might sound funny, but maybe not to you. Even when I try to do that mental altar and I get relaxed and I just meditate for a few minutes to kind of clear out my mind, I can almost smell the turf.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
could smell it, even though it's not burning.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that relationship between the senses and the memory and you're tying into
Yeah,
that.
maybe it's
Absolutely.
this Pavlovian response. I
Well,
see the altar no matter where it is. Oh, incense, turf.
the brain is an incredible organ. It really is. I mean, the things that it can generate. And then the question is, where is that coming from? Is that coming from outside of us? Is that coming from somewhere bigger than us? Is it just, the brain creating these hallucinations, right? And at the end of the day, I'm not sure it really matters. I think as long as you're engaging and it gets you to that space, what are the after effects of that? Is it a healthy after effect? So
You just brought up a good point. That's kind of one of my mantras,
Mhm.
or at least one of my mantras is it doesn't matter where it came from as long as it kind of works for you.
Mm.
Like
Mhm.
like when I hear people in more scientific minds say, "Oh, well, the pagans were, primitive and all that
Mhm.
stuff is rubbish and nonsense and whatever else." It's like, well, is it really?
Again, that privileging of one set of logic over
Right,
another, right? That idea that science and scientists have monopoly on the truth.
right.
Whereas, those of us who work in the spiritual fields, we know that this sense of what is considered truth is very different for different people. It's very subjective, and that there is no objective reality. There is objective
No, there
realities,
isn't.
right?
I
Yeah.
mean, the Druids and the pagans and the Celts, they might not have known some things. I'm sure they knew why that what the logic behind it, but
Mhm.
other things they might not have understood the science or whatever. They just knew it worked.
Yeah,
Does it
absolutely.
matter if we don't understand the inner workings of it and we just know it works? I say, who cares? If it works,
Mhm.
it works. And when people of the scientific mind poo-poo all those things
Mhm.
and make it seem like it's rubbish, or in the more religious perspective, the Abrahamic religion saying, you're going to go to hell if you look at that stuff. My perspective in all this is those paganism and all those things, they were around for many more thousands of years
Mhm.
before the Abrahamic religions or anything else, or science really became, modern science became into being.
Mhm.
Who are we to say that those things don't work?
Well, and I think this is a very modern cultural way of seeing the past. This is when we're really projecting back onto the past. We tend to see people in the past as stupid, as not
Right.
having the same information as us. I'm actually concurrently to kind of writing a book and also being a therapist. I'm working on a BA in history, so I'm studying classical studies, medieval studies, and also religious studies. And one of the biggest pieces we have to get around as modern people is the understanding that, or the prejudice that people in the past were stupid because
Yep.
they had the same brains as us. They had the same ability to conceptualize the world around them as us. What was missing was was data, right? But they were wise. They were absolutely wise, and in truth, they were probably wiser in connecting with their local landscapes than us people now.
Absolutely.
You know, but like, even though they conceptualized, say, the sun as a deity, they knew that there was a relationship between the sun and growth of fertility in the land. They knew that there was a relationship there,
Right.
right? They knew that if they hunted too much, there wouldn't be enough for next year. If they knew they gathered too much, they wouldn't have enough for next year. So over thousands of years, hundreds of generations, an understanding of the relationship between the landscape and themselves developed. And I think a lot of modern people don't understand that because they live a very different
Yeah.
lifestyle. I just love this example because I don't know, I have just a soft spot for them. But the Australian Aboriginal peoples, a whole continent of peoples down there, they've been in that landscape for perhaps 40 to 60,000 years. And over so many years, they've developed into their cultural, spiritual traditions, whole oral systems of memorizing information. And that information is to the point that, when they're engaged in ritual play, acting as animals, they call it the dream time, they can mimic the exact way that their animals that they're hunting will move and react. And they're teaching their children to know that if the animal moves in such a way, it means that that's the moment to attack them, and you'll be able to hunt them perfectly, right? Now, that sort of knowledge is not something that modern science has been able to do
Right.
until now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, we need to get over this prejudice that ancient people were stupid and that they were just ignorant in this and that. They had the exact same capacity to conceptualize the world around them as we did, as we do now. They just had different informational sets than we do now.
Yeah, I mean, I would even venture to say it's a possibility, pound for pound, they had more wisdom in their time than we do now.
See, I would tend to disagree with that. I'll be honest with you. I would tend to disagree with that because that, I would say, at least how I'm hearing it,
Right.
is that romanticism of the past. And that's another, I think, criticism I have of the modern pagan community is this romanticism of the past as being better. The whole idea of the golden age, right? I think that they were as wise as us. I think that they had they did certain things better than us because they weren't destroying their landscape, they weren't destroying their environment. But I don't necessarily think I personally would go so far as to say they were wiser. I think that again,
I
different.
guess let me rephrase it
Yeah.
a different way.
Sorry.
Got more out of their limited resources than we get out of our resources. I
Mm,
mean, they just, they survived in conditions that were much, much different than,
mhm,
and one could say worse than what we did now. I
mhm.
mean, they figured out the stars without giant telescopes.
Right.
Now,
Mhm.
that's kind of what I mean, more wisdom in that they just were able to do a lot more with what they had than necessarily maybe we do. Because I find modern people can't
Right.
get out of their own way.
What I heard in what you just said was that they were engaging with their landscape and their environment better than we, and I would totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I think the issue of modernity is that we don't engage with our landscape quite as much because we're not living in the landscape. 200 years ago, most people lived outside. Most North Americans, I think statistics are that most North Americans spend more time during the day inside at home than or in an office than they do actually being out and
Absolutely.
outside.
And I'm
Yeah,
I'm extremely guilty of that.
yeah, same here. But I think that kind of that is what working with Druidry and any spiritual tradition is the hope for, because all of those stories, a lot of them are outside, a lot of them are engaged with the landscape, a lot of them are in the characters, the gods, the spirits, whatever, being in the environment, versus now where we're reading about, in the Mabinogi, all of these amazing things, the country of Duffed and Slay and Blodaiwith up, in the mountains, wherever it is. We're reading about that while sitting comfortably inside our homes, right?
Yeah. And with all that mythology, I mean, yes, it's stories, but there's always truth in it. Getting back to the whole scientific type people thing is, I just wish the attitude would be more, it's not true because we proved it's not, as opposed to, well, we haven't proved it true, therefore it must not be true. I mean, what was it? The trees wasn't too long ago. They actually found out the trees are communicating with each other.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
if you
Yeah.
said it 5 years before that, well, that's not true. We can't prove it. Well, guess what? A few years later, you proved it. It's
Yeah. Yeah, this is the thing. This is the thing. Modern science has a lot of catching up to do when it comes to information. But this is the thing. Modern science evolved inside. Modern science evolved as a very particular way of viewing the world versus people who were actually in the world and exploring it every single day and connecting with it every single day. Right? You. It's funny what modernity kind of disconnects us from. Right?
yeah. The key is just, I guess, in a way, being open minded and receptive to some degree. And
Mhm.
I think by doing that, you might find your path, and you might find a spirituality that will in itself, hopefully have a positive effect on your mental health because you
Mhm.
went where you're supposed to go, where you need to go,
Mhm.
as opposed to it being prescribed. I mean, I'm very guilty. I was very close minded when I was younger. Part of that was from my Catholic upbringing. Part of it was just from my personality, my OCD, my rigidity. No,
Mhm.
it's black or it's white. There's no gray.
Mm.
No, it took me a while to break out of it, and I did. And I think a lot of people are kind of stuck in it.
Everybody's on their own journey, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
For you, it was important at that moment to step out of that, and for other people, wherever they are, that's where they are. In truth, I think that's really where I've come to in my life recently, is that understanding that wherever somebody is, that's where they are. I think that some things just serve people, some things don't serve people, and they're just caught in something. There's all sorts of different things. Yeah.
Well, do you have any final words or advice or anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Absolutely. Well, so bringing us back to kind of the purpose of your work, then, to figure out the relationship between kind of Druidry and Celtic traditions to kind of the modern mental health, I would say that at least from kind of how I work with this material, a lot of these myths, a lot of these traditions, a lot of these practices, they developed in such a way, and they're being developed in such a way now as to allow people to find themselves. And I think that for me is really the crux of my work, creating a space where people can find themselves and reconnect with themselves. And we often do that through looking at other people's examples. So whether it be ancestors, whether it be, one of my favorites is fictional characters, whether it be gods or deities, whatever it is, whoever those external people are or figures are. And so when approaching these traditions, I would say, bring it back to yourself, because, depending on how you conceptualize these individuals, if you conceptualize gods as literal gods in the sky or in the ground or in the universe around you, then, they're living their own separate existence. Your relationship to them is what's going to determine kind of what the benefits are for you. But I think also that sense of respect, going back to what Confucius was saying, by learning to respect and honor the invisible, we learn to respect and honor the visible, right? Ourselves included. And I think that can be very helpful. I think the other, the last point I would like to say, just from a scope of practice point of view, and as also a professional in these fields, is that spirituality in itself can help, but it is no replacement for grounded psychological assistance.
Oh, absolutely.
So, yeah, absolutely. And I do find oftentimes, that people who are promoting this idea that spirituality is a direct replacement. Spirituality has had within it, methods of healing and methods of mitigating issues. If you are dealing with any kind of biomedical or biochemical issue, especially anything to do with mental health issues, it has to be in parallel. You can't go off into the world of spirituality.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. It's a very important point.
Absolutely.
As we were discussing before we started to record, when I explained my story, I said, I've done therapy, I've taken the meds, I've done all the things you need to do. Now I'm looking at these other ideas as add-ons to get me the rest of the way there, or maybe I can reduce one medication or something. But this is not the end-all, be-all answer.
Absolutely. In truth, I mean, that's the thing. This, the practices, they evolved in such a way that they did have, a lot of the counselors back in the day were also spiritual specialists, right? But they developed an understanding of those practices while being in those roles. Now we have those specialized roles of therapists and counselors. And I, as a therapist, I utilize a lot of spirituality in my work. But I also know that with certain clients, when they come to me, like somebody with a particular mental health diagnosis, any kind of meditation or visual exercise would not be appropriate. And so for me, working in both fields, I've had to be very conscious of that. And so I would say that for people who are interested in exploring that for themselves, understanding the limitations of, kind of Western psychotherapeutic approaches, but also the limitations of spirituality, finding that for themselves, becoming self-aware, right?
And that could take quite a while to find your way.
Yeah, exactly.
I look at all these things as different arrows in the quiver. Some are more powerful and bigger, some are smaller, but it's a tool.
It's a tool in the toolkit. And as we know, toolkits often have multiple tools in them. Absolutely.
Yep. Well, thank you for joining me today, Ben. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed speaking with you.
I enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you again.
Thanks for watching this interview. If you enjoyed it, please click the subscribe button and the little bell icon next to it. Also, if you liked the video as much as I liked conducting it, then please hit that thumbs up button to let me know that you liked it. Before you go, be sure to check out my other content, like the following.